Imagine for a moment you are alone. The world outside your thin, wooden walls has been erased, swallowed by a blizzard that howls like 1,000 lost souls. The wind doesn't whisper. It screams, clawing at the gaps in the logs, desperate to get inside. The temperature has plummeted to a point you didn't know was possible, a cold so profound it feels solid, a physical weight pressing down on your chest. Your breath hangs in the air inside your own home, a constant, frozen reminder of your vulnerability. The fire in your hearth is your only God, your only savior, and you know with a chilling certainty that if it goes out, you will not live to see the morning. This wasn't a nightmare for the pioneers, the homesteaders, the trappers, and the cowboys of the American West. This was winter. And the single most important, most desperate challenge of that season, every single night, was the simple, primal act of sleep.
How did they do it?
How did human beings, often with little more than what they could carry on a wagon or on their back, manage to find rest in the face of such brutal, unforgiving cold? The answer is a story of incredible ingenuity, heartbreaking hardship, and a raw, desperate battle for survival fought every single night from dusk until dawn. It's a story written not in history books, but in the very fabric of their homes, their beds, and their nightly rituals. This is how the West was won. One frigid, terrifying night at a time. The common image of the Wild West, the one burned into our collective consciousness by a century of film and television, is one of sun-baked deserts, dusty towns, and scorching high-noon duels. We see cowboys driving cattle under a relentless sun, gold prospectors panning in shallow, sun-drenched streams, and sheriffs squinting against the glare off the main street. It's a warm, often hot landscape, and for much of the year, across vast swathes of the West, this image is accurate. But this is only half the story. The other half is a season of pure, unadulterated severity. A season that could, and frequently did, kill. To understand the sleep of the Wild West, you must first understand the winter of the Wild West. This was not the gentle, snow-dusted winter of a New England postcard. This was a continental climate at its most extreme. The Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the high deserts of Wyoming and Montana, these lands are exposed with little to break the wind that sweeps down from the Arctic. The term blue norther was coined for a reason. A pleasant autumn day could, in a matter of hours, transform into a life-threatening deep freeze. Temperatures of 30, 40, even 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit were not unheard of. In the winter of 1886-1887, famously known as the Great Die-Up, temperatures in Montana plummeted to 60 degrees. Cattle, the very economic lifeblood of the region, froze, standing up, their bodies forming grisly, ice-covered statues that dotted the landscape by the thousands. If that's what happened to thousands of pounds of hardy Texas longhorn, what chance did a 150-pound human being have? The cold was only one enemy, the snow was another. Blizzards on the plains could dump feet of snow, but their true danger was the wind. The snow didn't fall gently. It was picked up and hurled horizontally by winds that could reach hurricane force. This created the dreaded whiteout, where visibility dropped to 0. A man could become disoriented and lost, just walking from his cabin to his barn. There are countless accounts of people perishing mere yards from their own front door, suffocated by drifts, frozen solid where they fell. The snow itself could be a death trap, but it also served as an insulator, a paradox we will return to. And then there was the silence. After the storm passed, an eerie, absolute silence would descend. A silence so complete it was deafening. In that silence, the only sound was the desperate internal struggle to stay warm, to conserve energy, and to prepare for the next long, dark, terrifying night. So, where did people sleep? The answer is as varied as the people themselves, but each dwelling was a first line of defense, a fortress against the cold. Let's start with the most iconic, the log cabin. The image of a little log cabin nestled in a snowy clearing is a romantic one, but the reality was a constant battle against the elements. A well-built log cabin was a marvel of practical engineering. The logs were not merely stacked. They were carefully notched and fitted at the corners, a skill every frontiersman needed to master. The gaps between the logs, however, were a major problem. No matter how well hewn the logs were, there would be cracks and chinks, and through these chinks the wind whistled and the cold seeped in like an invisible poison. The solution was chinking and daubing. This was a two-part process. First, the chinking. This involved taking whatever material was available, thin strips of wood, stones, pieces of bark, and wedging them into the larger gaps between the logs. This provided a rough base. Then came the daubing. This was the sealant. A mixture was made and its composition varied wildly based on local resources. The most common base was clay, dug from a nearby riverbank or the ground itself. To this clay, they would add other materials to give it strength and prevent excessive cracking as it dried. This could include sand, crushed limestone, animal hair, often from horses or oxen, and even dry grass or straw. This sticky, muddy substance was then packed by hand into the remaining gaps over the chinking, sealing the wall. A well-done chinking and daubing job was the difference between a relatively snug cabin and a wind-swept shack, but it was never perfect. It would shrink and crack over time, requiring constant maintenance. A fall chore, as crucial as stocking firewood, was to redaub the cabin, to patch all the new cracks that had appeared over the summer, preparing for the siege of winter. The roof was another critical point. A simple sod roof, common in prairie homes where trees were scarce, could be surprisingly effective at insulation, but it was heavy and leaked terribly during thaws. More common in timbered areas was a shake roof, hand-split wooden shingles. These kept the rain out, but cold air would freely circulate underneath them. Often the inside of the roof had no ceiling. You could look up and see the underside of the shakes and the rafters, with the dust of the day sifting down. To combat this, some homesteaders would create a loft or a false ceiling, not for extra space, but to trap a layer of dead air, a poor man's insulation between the living space and the roof. The floor was often just packed earth. A dirt floor was cold, damp, and a source of what they called chill. To improve it, some would lay a floor of puncheons, logs split in half with the flat side facing up. This was better than dirt, but the gaps between the puncheons still let in the cold from the ground below. The truly fortunate might have a plank floor, but even this was laid directly over the ground, with no foundation or insulation. The cold rose from the earth itself, a constant sucking chill that attacked the feet first. Then there was the door and the window. A frontier cabin door was often a simple, heavy affair of planks, hung on leather or wooden hinges. It rarely fit perfectly in its frame. The gap at the bottom was a notorious entry point for cold air, and sometimes snow. People would often lay a rolled-up rug, a sack of straw, or even just a long, narrow log, a door snake, along the bottom to block the draft. Windows were the greatest luxury and the greatest weakness. Glass was fragile, expensive, and difficult to transport. Many early cabins had no windows at all, relying on the open door for light. Those that did often used paper windows, oiled paper stretched over the opening. It let in a dim, amber light, but it was useless for seeing out and provided almost no insulation. A single pane of glass was a treasure, but it was a thermal hole, a cold spot on the wall where frost would form thickly on the inside. The fireplace was the heart of the home, and its design was crucial. The early, open, roaring fireplace we see in movies is actually quite inefficient. It draws a tremendous amount of air from the room to feed the fire, and most of the heat goes straight up the chimney. The pioneers knew this. They needed a way to capture and radiate that heat. The solution, which transformed survival in cold climates, was the stone or brick hearth and chimney. A massive stone fireplace, often large enough for a person to almost stand in, would be built on one wall. The stones would absorb the immense heat of the fire and then slowly radiate it back into the room for hours after the flames had died down. Going to bed with a well-stoked hot fireplace was like going to bed with a thermal battery. The heat stored in those stones was often the only thing that kept the cabin from reaching freezing temperatures by dawn. But the cabin was just the shell. The real art of winter sleep was in the bed itself. This was the inner sanctum, the final refuge. And here, the pioneers showed a level of creativity and desperation that is humbling. The bed was rarely a standalone piece of furniture as we know it. It was often a built-in bunk, a platform attached to the wall, sometimes in a corner, to take advantage of two radiating walls. But the structure was irrelevant. What mattered was what was on it. This was a world before central heating, before electric blankets, before insulating synthetics. They had to create warmth from whatever the land provided. The first and most important element was the mattress. But it wasn't a mattress of springs and foam. It was a tick. A tick was a large bag sewn from sturdy cloth like ticking, which is where the name comes from, or any other available heavy fabric. This bag was then stuffed, and what you stuffed it with was a matter of life and death. The most common stuffing was straw or hay. It was readily available, and it provided a decent loft, creating a layer of trapped air between the sleeper and the cold platform below. But straw had significant drawbacks. It broke down quickly, becoming compacted and lumpy within a few weeks. It was also a haven for pests, fleas, lice, and mites that would torment the sleepers. Every few months, the old, musty, pest-ridden straw would be emptied out, the tick would be beaten clean, and fresh straw would be stuffed inside. This was a seasonal ritual, a small celebration of comfort. A significant upgrade from straw was hay, specifically prairie grass or wild hay. It was softer, more resilient, and had a sweeter smell. But the gold standard for mattress stuffing was feathers. A feather bed was a sign of relative prosperity. A family would spend years saving feathers from every goose, duck, and chicken they plucked. A fully stuffed feather tick was a magnificent thing. It was incredibly soft, molded to the body, and provided superb insulation. The down feathers created millions of tiny air pockets that trapped the body's heat magnificently. To sink into a feather bed on a cold night was the height of frontier luxury. But even this had its downside. Feather beds could be oppressively hot in the summer, and they required constant fluffing and airing to prevent the feathers from matting down. But the mattress was only the beginning. The real secret to surviving a winter night was in the layers on top of it. This is where the concept of bedding was pushed to its absolute limit. The first layer on the sleeper was, of course, their nightclothes. But pajamas as we know them didn't exist. Most people slept in their underclothes, which for men was a long one-piece garment of wool or flannel called a union suit. For women, it was a long flannel nightgown. The key was wool. Cotton was a death fabric in the winter. Once it got damp from sweat or condensation, it lost all its insulating properties and could literally draw the heat from your body. Wool, on the other hand, retains its insulating properties even when wet. It was itchy, it was scratchy, but it saved lives. On top of the sleeper went a staggering pile of covers. This was not one or two blankets. This was a system. The first layer might be a simple sheet, though many skipped this. Then came the blankets. Wool blankets were essential. A family might have several, often traded for or brought from the east at great expense. The famous Hudson's Bay point blanket, with its distinctive colored stripes, was a prized possession, a symbol of both survival and status. But often, homemade blankets were the norm. These were woven on a loom from the wool of their own sheep, thick, heavy, and incredibly warm. But blankets alone were often not enough. The pinnacle of frontier bedding was the comforter, or what we would call a duvet, but these weren't filled with synthetic fibers. They were filled with the same materials as the mattresses, wool carding, feathers, or even cattail down. These comforters were immensely heavy. To be buried under a proper frontier comforter was to feel a significant weight pressing down on you. This weight was not just psychological. It helped compress the layers of clothing underneath and reduce air circulation, which in turn reduced heat loss. And then there was the final, most ingenious layer, the bed rug, or a simple, heavy woven rug. This was placed on top of everything else. Its purpose was to trap the warm air that rose from the sleeper's body and prevent it from escaping into the frigid room air. Think of it as putting a lid on your personal bedpot. The temperature difference between the space under the covers and the room could be 30, 40, or even 50 degrees. The bed was a microclimate, a fragile pocket of summer in a world of ice. But what if the bed itself was cold? Going to bed in a freezing cold tick was a miserable and potentially dangerous experience. The body would have to expend a huge amount of energy just to warm up the immediate sleeping space. The solution was the bed warmer. This was a long-handled covered pan, usually made of brass or copper. Before bedtime, it would be filled with hot coals from the fireplace, the lid closed, and then it would be slid between the sheets, moving it slowly up and down the bed to take the deathly chill off the linen. The hiss of the hot metal on the cold, damp sheets, the smell of warm wool and wood smoke. This was the sensory prelude to a safe night's sleep. It was a dangerous tool. A stray ember could easily set the entire bed on fire, turning a refuge into a funeral pyre. But the risk was deemed worth the reward. For those without a metal bed warmer, there were other methods. Heated stones wrapped in cloth or leather made excellent, if cumbersome, bed warmers. They held heat for a long time and could be placed at the foot of the bed to warm the crucial extremity of the feet. Another common practice was to heat a large, smooth stone directly in the fire, wrap it securely in a piece of old blanket, and use it as a foot warmer. The gentle, radiant heat from a stone could last for hours. Now, let's step away from the relative security of the homesteader's cabin and venture into the wider, wilder West. Let's talk about the men for whom a fixed roof was a rarity, the cowboys. The cowboy's life is romanticized as one of freedom and adventure on the open range, and it was, in its way. But in the winter, that freedom could be a death sentence. Cowboys spent most of their time in line shacks or on the trail, and their sleeping arrangements were the very definition of minimalist. The line shack was a crude, small cabin placed out on the far reaches of a ranch's territory, used by cowboys patrolling the fence lines. These were not cozy homesteads. They were hastily built, often with poorly chinked logs, a dirt floor, a tiny stove instead of a fireplace, and little more than a couple of bunks inside. The bedding was whatever the ranch supplied, which was often minimal, a couple of coarse wool blankets and a tick stuffed with the least desirable straw. It was cold, drafty, and lonely. A cowboy spending a winter in a line shack was engaged in a monotonous, grueling battle for survival. His world shrunk to the few feet between the stove and his bunk. But it was on the trail, during a winter cattle drive or while out hunting strays, that the cowboy faced the ultimate test of his hardiness. There was no cabin, no stove, often not even a tent. His bed was the ground itself. His entire sleeping system had to be carried on his saddle. This system was built around two key items: his saddle and his sugun. The saddle was not just for riding. At night it became part of his bed. He would lay it on its side and the wooden stirrup became a pillow. This elevated his head slightly off the ground. But the ground was cold, sucking the heat from his body through conduction. To combat this, he would first, if possible, scrape away the snow and build a fire right on the ground where he intended to sleep. Once the fire had burned down to hot coals, he would scrape them aside and lay his bedroll on the warmed earth. This was a risky maneuver, but it could make the difference between a few hours of fitful sleep and freezing to death. His bedroll was his mobile home. It consisted of one or two wool blankets, and if he was lucky, a waterproof ground sheet of oilcloth or canvas. The most prized possession, the cowboys' equivalent of the homesteaders' featherbed, was the sugan. A sugan was a heavy quilt, often made from scraps of old clothing or blankets, sewn together between two layers of sturdy fabric. It was thick, heavy, and designed for one purpose: extreme cold. He would wrap himself in his blankets, then cocoon himself inside the sugan. But the most critical element of the cowboy's cold-weather sleep system was something he shared with soldiers, trappers, and explorers: the ability to sleep in a seated position, wrapped in his blankets, leaning against his saddle, which was propped against a tree or a rock. This kept him off the coldest ground altogether and allowed him to quickly spring to his feet if danger approached. It was a miserable way to sleep, but it was often the safest. In a blizzard, he might simply hunker down in the lee of his horse, using the animal's body as a windbreak. The horse's own heat provided a small, precious bubble of warmth. The relationship between a cowboy and his horse was one of survival, and on a cold night, that survival was literal and mutual. Then there were the mountain men, the trappers who ventured into the highest, coldest reaches of the Rockies, often completely alone for months at a time. These men were the true masters of winter survival. Their knowledge wasn't from books. It was written in frostbite scars and the memories of comrades who didn't make it. They learned from the original masters of the North American winter, the native tribes. The mountain man's shelter of choice in deep winter was the lean-to. This was not the flimsy summer camp structure. A winter lean-to was a serious affair. He would find a fallen log or a rock face as a back wall. Then he would lean heavy poles against it, creating a steep, slanted roof. On this roof, he would lay a thick layer of pine boughs, starting at the bottom and overlapping them like shingles to shed water and snow. Then he would pile on layers of snow. Snow, paradoxically, is an excellent insulator. A well-built, snow-covered lean-to with a small fire built in front of it could be remarkably warm. The fire's heat would reflect off the back wall and the packed snow, creating a radiant oven effect. His bed inside the lean-to would be a deep pile of fresh green pine boughs. The boughs lifted him off the frozen ground and provided their own insulation. The scent of the pine was a bonus, a small piece of olfactory comfort in a world of hardship. He would wrap himself in his blankets and furs, beaver, buffalo, or bear, and sleep with his feet towards the fire. The key was to keep the fire going all night, which required waking up every few hours to add fuel. This fragmented sleep was the price of survival. To sleep through the night could mean to sleep forever. The mountain men also perfected the use of the fire hole. Before laying his pine bough bed, he would dig a shallow pit where his torso would lie. He would build a fire in this pit, let it burn down to coals, then cover the coals with a few inches of soil. This created a sleeping platform that was heated from below, like a primitive electric blanket. It was a delicate art. Too much soil and the heat was lost. Too little, and he risked burning his blankets or himself. But when done correctly, it provided hours of blessed, radiant warmth from the ground up. These were the dwellings and the basic bed systems, but the battle for sleep was fought on other fronts as well. It was fought in the body and in the mind. The physical act of sleeping in the cold is a taxing physiological process. The body, in order to preserve its core temperature for the vital organs, reduces blood flow to the extremities. This is why fingers, toes, ears, and the nose are the most susceptible to frostbite. Going to sleep with cold feet was a common and deeply uncomfortable reality. The body would shiver, a violent involuntary muscle contraction designed to generate heat. It is impossible to sleep while shivering violently. So, the pre-sleep ritual was as much about preparing the body as it was about preparing the bed. People would often do calisthenics before bed, jumping jacks, running in place, anything to get the blood flowing and raise their core temperature before diving under the covers. They would eat a large, fatty meal right before bed. The digestion of fat produces metabolic heat, stoking the body's internal furnace. A chunk of fatty salt pork or a dollop of lard in a stew was not just calories, it was fuel for the night. They would also drink hot liquids, not coffee, which could disrupt sleep, but herbal teas or just hot water to warm themselves from the inside out. But perhaps the most intimate, the most human, and the most effective method of all was shared body heat. In a one-room cabin, the entire family often slept in one bed. Parents, children, babies, all huddled together under a mountain of covers. The warmth generated by multiple bodies in close proximity was significant. It was the difference between a survivable night and a fatal one. It was not uncommon for itinerant workers, or cowboys in a line shack, to sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, head to toe, for the same reason. It was a practice born of pure necessity, stripping away all notions of privacy and personal space in the face of a shared enemy. The cold was a great equalizer, a force that reminded everyone of their fundamental animal need for warmth and community. This practice extended to animals as well. It was not unusual for a family to bring a prized milk cow, a dog, or even chickens into the cabin on a particularly brutal night. The body heat of the animals raised the ambient temperature of the entire cabin by a few precious degrees. The smell and the mess were inconveniences that were gladly endured for the sake of survival. The line between the human dwelling and the barn became blurred, a testament to the collective struggle against the elements. The psychological aspect of winter sleep cannot be overstated. The fear was a constant bedfellow. The fear of the fire going out, the fear of waking up to find a child's face frostbitten, the fear of the storm that would never end, trapping them until the food ran out. This was a time before weather forecasts. A snowstorm could begin at dusk and continue for 3 days with no warning. The isolation was profound. The silence after the storm was not peaceful. It was ominous, a sign that the world was frozen shut, that you were utterly alone. To close your eyes and surrender to sleep in such conditions was an act of profound courage. It was a trust fall into the arms of fate, a hope that the embers would last, that the body would endure, and that the sun would, eventually, rise again on a world you were still alive to see. The Native American tribes of the Plains and the Rockies had been perfecting the art of winter survival for millennia, and their technologies and techniques were often adopted and adapted by the European settlers, though not always with the same level of understanding. The tribes understood the land in a way the newcomers did not. For instance, the Plains Indians' use of the buffalo was total, and this extended to their sleep systems. A buffalo robe was one of the most effective cold-weather sleeping aids ever devised. The hide was incredibly thick and dense, and the fur, particularly the winter coat, was a superb insulator. A single buffalo robe could provide more warmth than 3 or 4 wool blankets. To sleep wrapped in a buffalo robe with the fur side in was to be enveloped in a portable ecosystem of warmth. The tribes also used teepees, which are often misunderstood as simple summer shelters. A properly configured winter teepee was a marvel of efficient heating. The conical shape and the smoke flaps at the top created a powerful draft, drawing air in from the bottom and venting smoke out the top. A small fire in the center could heat the entire space efficiently, and the buffalo hide covers, lashed tightly to the ground, kept the wind out far better than a log cabin's chinking ever could. The settlers saw the value of these items, and buffalo robes became a staple of the fur trade and a common sight in frontier homes and on sleighs. But the adoption was often superficial. The settlers took the object, but not always the deeper knowledge that came with it, the understanding of wind patterns, of snow compaction, of the subtle signs of a changing weather that were second nature to the people who had lived on the land for generations. As we have seen, the bed was the epicenter of winter survival, but the preparation for sleep began long before dusk. It was a day-long endeavor. The entire rhythm of a frontier homestead in winter was geared towards the coming night. The primary task, the most back-breaking and never-ending chore, was the procurement of firewood. A winter in the northern plains or the Rockies could require 10 to 15 cords of wood to see a single family through. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Imagine the sheer volume. This wood had to be felled with axes and crosscut saws, hauled by sled, split with mauls, and stacked meticulously to dry. Boys who were too young for other heavy labor were often given the sole responsibility of keeping the wood box by the fireplace full. It was a task that started in childhood and continued for a lifetime. The sound of an axe biting into wood was the soundtrack of autumn, a frantic race against the first snow. The wood itself was chosen with care. Different woods burned differently. Softwoods like pine and cedar caught easily and burned hot and fast, perfect for quickly taking the chill off a room or for starting a fire. But they were useless for lasting through the night. For that, you needed hardwoods, oak, hickory, maple, or in the West, dense, slow-burning woods like ironwood or applewood if available. These woods burned slowly and produced a deep, long-lasting bed of coals. The final act before bed, the banking of the fire, was a precise science. The fire was not put out. That would be suicide. It was banked. This meant piling the hot coals together and covering them with a thick layer of ash, and then placing 1 or 2 large, slow-burning logs on top. This created a kind of thermal battery that would smolder for hours, keeping the core of the fire alive and radiating a low, steady heat. In the morning, the ash could be scraped away, a few pieces of kindling added, and with a good bellows or a puff of breath, the fire would spring back to life. A properly banked fire was a family's most treasured possession. Water was another pre-sleep concern. Any water left in a bucket inside the cabin would freeze solid by morning. To have water available for the morning fire and for drinking, the bucket was often placed on the hearth, close enough to the banked fire to keep it from freezing, but not so close that it boiled away. Another method was to store the water in a wooden barrel. Wood is a better insulator than metal, so it would freeze more slowly. But often, the morning routine began with breaking the ice in the water bucket and melting it over the newly stoked fire. The lighting of the evening was also part of the sleep preparation. Candles were precious, and lamp oil was expensive. The fire provided the main light. As the evening wore on, activities would wind down. Mending, whittling, reading, all would cease as the family gathered around the fading light of the hearth. This natural dimming of light helped signal to their bodies that it was time to sleep, aligning their circadian rhythms with the sun in a way that is foreign to us in our electrically lit world. The onset of darkness was a physical command to rest, to conserve energy, to retreat into the warmth of the bed. The bedtime ritual was a family affair. It was a sequence of practiced, life-sustaining steps. The fire was banked. The bed warmers were deployed. The heavy wooden bar was slid across the door, locking out not just potential human threats, but the symbolic threat of the cold and the wild. The family would huddle together, say their prayers that were likely more fervent in winter than at any other time, and then they would dive into the icy sheets, relying on their collective body heat and the layers of bedding to slowly create a habitable environment. The first few minutes were often the worst, a gasp-inducing shock as their warm bodies met the cold linen. But gradually, as their body heat filled the space under the covers, a fragile equilibrium was reached. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the darkness, the sound of the wind, the smell of wood smoke and wool, and the shared, rhythmic breathing of a family clinging to life and to each other, waiting for the dawn. This was the reality for the settled folk. But what of those on the move? What of the thousands of emigrants on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails? Their journey was perilous enough with river crossings, disease, and potential conflicts, but a winter on the trail was a catastrophe. Most wagon trains aimed to be through the mountain passes by late autumn, But miscalculations, delays, and early storms could trap them. The story of the Donner Party is the most infamous example, but it was far from the only one. For a wagon train caught in a snowstorm, sleep became a ghastly parody of the homesteaders' routine. The wagon itself was the only shelter. Families would huddle inside the wooden box, wrapped in every piece of clothing and blanket they owned. The canvas cover, which provided shade from the summer sun, was a flimsy barrier against snow and wind. They would try to insulate the wagon by piling snow around the bottom, creating a kind of igloo effect. Sometimes they would dig a snow cave under the wagon itself. But with food running low, morale shattered, and the cold unrelenting, sleep was often the gateway to death. Hypothermia sets in not with a struggle, but with a seductive warmth and an overwhelming desire to sleep. Many pioneers simply lay down in their wagons or in snowdrifts and never woke up. Their sleep was eternal. The brutal winters of the Wild West forged a particular kind of character. It bred a profound resilience, a deep appreciation for simple comforts, and a stoic acceptance of hardship. It also bred a peculiar form of anxiety that lingered for a lifetime, even after the person had moved to a warmer climate. The sound of a rising wind on a winter's night could trigger a deep-seated fear, a primal memory of those long nights spent listening, waiting, and praying for the sun. The methods they developed, the layered bedding, the banked fires, the shared body heat, are a testament to human ingenuity in the face of raw nature. They had no technology to separate them from the environment. They were embedded in it, exposed to its whims. Their nightly battle for sleep was a microcosm of the larger pioneer struggle, a relentless, grinding effort to carve out a sliver of warmth, safety, and civilization in a vast, cold, and indifferent wilderness. And as we will see in the next part, this struggle extended beyond the home and the trail, into the very towns and cities of the West, where the solutions became more communal, but the stakes remained just as high. In the first part of our story, we hunkered down inside the lonely homesteader's cabin and the cowboys' frozen bedroll, exploring the personal, intimate battle for warmth in the vast, empty wilderness. But the Wild West wasn't just isolated farms and lonely trails. It was also towns and cities springing up almost overnight, fueled by gold rushes, cattle money, and the railroad. And in these bustling, often chaotic communities, the challenge of winter sleep took on a new, more social dimension. The battle against the cold was no longer just a family affair. It became a commercial enterprise, a civic concern, and for many, a desperate struggle in the crowded, squalid, and shockingly dangerous world of the boarding house and the hotel. Welcome to the winter in the western town. Picture it, a main street of frozen mud, rutted deep by wagon wheels and now hardened into a landscape of jagged, icy trenches. Wooden boardwalks line the street, their planks slick with frost. The false-fronted buildings, so impressive in the summer sun, now look thin and vulnerable, their paint peeling in the dry, cold air. Smoke pours from 100 chimneys, a thick, low-hanging pall that smells of pine, coal, and, if the wind is right, the stockyards on the edge of town. The sounds are different too. The ring of a blacksmith's hammer has a sharper, more brittle tone. The laughter from a saloon is swallowed quickly by the cold, and at night the town is not quiet. It is alive with the sounds of survival, the ceaseless crunch of boots on snow, the distant howl of a wolf or a lonely dog, and the constant, underlying fear of fire. Because in a town built almost entirely of wood, canvas and tar paper, fire was the cold's twin terror. A single overturned lantern, a spark from a faulty chimney, could, and frequently did, reduce an entire block to ashes in minutes, leaving its inhabitants homeless in the dead of winter. The fear of fire was so pervasive that it directly influenced sleeping arrangements. People were wary of banking their fires too high. They installed metal spark arresters on their chimneys, Town councils passed ordinances about the storage of hay and gunpowder. To fall asleep in a western town was to trust not only in your own fire management skills, but in those of your often drunk, often careless neighbor. For the single men who made up the majority of many western towns, the miners, the clerks, the gamblers, the laborers, home was not a private cabin. It was a boarding house, a hotel, or a rented cot in the back of a saloon. And here, the quality of your winter's sleep was a direct function of your wealth. Let's start at the bottom of the social ladder and work our way up. At the very bottom was the flop house. These were not official establishments, but rather any space that could be rented for a few cents a night. It could be the attic of a stable, the cellar of a store, or simply a row of cots in a drafty, uninsulated shack. There was no privacy, no cleanliness, and certainly no comfort. The bedding, if it existed at all, was a thin, filthy tick stuffed with mouldy straw or sawdust, and a single, greasy blanket that had been used by countless men before. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and despair. In such a place, sleep was not about rest. It was about temporary unconsciousness, a few hours of escape from the cold and the misery of waking life. Men would huddle together for warmth, their bodies pressed against strangers, a grim parody of the family bed back on the homestead. The risk of theft was high, so a man would often sleep with his boots on, his money belt secured, and one hand on his knife. It was a fitful, anxious, and dangerous sleep. To wake up with frostbite on an ear or a toe was a common occurrence. To wake up at all was a minor victory. A step up from the flop house was the common boarding house. These were ubiquitous in every western town. Usually run by a widow or a married couple, they offered a bed and meals for a weekly or monthly rate. The sleeping accommodations were typically in a dormitory-style room with several beds, or more often, several cots, crammed together. The quality varied wildly. A good boarding house, run by a conscientious landlady, could be a relative haven. The ticks would be stuffed with fresh straw or corn husks on a regular basis. There would be a decent wool blanket for each bed. A pot-bellied stove in the center of the room would be kept burning through the night, and one of the boarders might be assigned the task of stoking it every few hours. There was still snoring, the smell of damp wool drying, and the sounds of other men tossing and turning, but it was a marked improvement. The shared body heat of a dozen men in a sealed room could make it almost stuffy, a luxury compared to the outside air. But a bad boarding house was its own special kind of hell. The stove might be small and inefficient, leaving the corners of the room frigid. The blankets might be thin and worn, their nap long gone. The chinking in the walls might be crumbling, allowing gusts of wind to sweep across the sleepers. And then there were the bedbugs. These tiny, blood-sucking pests thrived in the cracks of wooden bed frames and the seams of ticks. They would emerge at night, drawn by the warmth and carbon dioxide of the sleeping men, and feast. Their bites left itchy, red welts all over the body. A man could go to bed exhausted and wake up hours later, covered in bites, scratching himself raw, unable to sleep from the torment. The only defense was to douse the bed with kerosene, a dangerous and only partially effective remedy, or to place the legs of the bed in cans of kerosene, creating a moat the bugs couldn't cross. It was a constant losing battle. For those with a little more money, there was the hotel. Western hotels range from the barely adequate to the surprisingly opulent, like the Palmer House in Denver or the Gold Hill Hotel in Nevada. Even in the better establishments, winter posed immense challenges. The primary issue was heating individual rooms. Central heating existed in the form of steam or hot water systems, but this was a rare and expensive technology found only in the very newest and most luxurious buildings in the largest cities. For the vast majority of hotels, heat came from a fireplace in each room, or later a small freestanding coal stove. This created a logistical nightmare for the hotel staff. Each room's fire had to be laid, lit, and maintained individually. A guest would arrive at a cold room and have to request a fire. A bellboy would bring wood or coal, start the fire, and then it would take an hour or more for the small room to become tolerably warm. The guest, if they were wise, would then bank the fire before bed, hoping it would last the night. But these room fires were notoriously inefficient and dangerous. Chimneys needed constant sweeping to prevent creosote buildup, a major cause of chimney fires. A guest might fall asleep with the stove damper open too wide, overheating the room and risking asphyxiation or setting the room on fire. Or they might close it too much, allowing carbon monoxide, the silent, odorless killer, to seep into the room. The bedding in hotels was often a point of pride. A good hotel advertised spring mattresses and clean linen. The spring mattress, a relatively new invention, was a sign of modernity and comfort. But in the winter, these metal springs could become intensely cold, conducting heat away from the body far more effectively than a solid platform or a straw tick. The solution was to use a thick, horsehair mattress topper or multiple layers of blankets underneath the sleeper to create a thermal barrier. The linens, while clean, were icy to the touch. It was common practice for a guest to ring for a servant to bring a bed warmer, a brass pan filled with hot coals, to be run between the sheets before retiring. The very wealthiest citizens, the mine owners, the cattle barons, the merchants who had struck it rich, slept in a world apart. Their homes, often large Victorian-style mansions, were fortresses against the cold, equipped with the latest technologies. They might have furnaces in the basement, burning coal or coke, with a network of ducts distributing warm air throughout the house. They had interior plumbing, which meant no late-night trips to an outhouse in a blizzard. Their bedrooms were spacious, but often still difficult to heat. High ceilings allowed hot air to rise, leaving the floor level chilly. They compensated with immense amounts of fuel and with luxurious bedding. A wealthy family's bed was a piece of heavy furniture, often with thick curtains called bed hangings, that could be drawn closed at night. These hangings, made of velvet, brocade, or heavy wool, created a microclimate within the bed, a tiny private room that trapped the sleeper's body heat magnificently. Their mattresses were thick horsehair or feather beds of the highest quality. Their blankets were the finest Welsh wool or even silk. They slept under eiderdown comforters filled with the supremely insulating down from the eider duck, a luxury import from Europe. They could afford to heat their bedrooms to a temperature that would have been considered scandalously wasteful by a homesteader. Their sleep was, by the standards of the age, comfortable and secure. But even they were not immune. A coal shortage, a broken furnace, or a particularly vicious cold snap could still bring the reality of the western winter crashing through their double-hung windows. Beyond the world of permanent structures was a more transient and equally challenging environment, the mining camp. A mining camp in winter was a special kind of purgatory. Tucked into a high mountain canyon, it was often starved of sunlight for months. The buildings were thrown up with reckless speed, using green timber that shrank and split as it dried, creating a labyrinth of drafts. The miners slept in bunkhouses, long, low buildings filled with rows of double-decker bunks. Each man had his own bunk, his sugin, and his personal effects. Heat was provided by a single pot-bellied stove at one end of the long room. The men whose bunks were near the stove slept in a sweat, while those at the far end slept in their coats and hats, their breath frosting in the air. Arguments over bunk proximity to the stove were common and could turn violent. The greatest fear in a mining camp bunkhouse, besides the cold, was carbon monoxide. The stoves were often poorly vented, and the buildings were tightly sealed to conserve heat. A blocked flue or a downdraft could fill the bunkhouse with the deadly gas while the men slept. There are tragic accounts of entire bunkhouses being found dead in the morning, the men seemingly peacefully asleep in their bunks claimed by an invisible killer. To mitigate this, the night watchman or fireman had the crucial job of not just stoking the fire, but of checking the air. sometimes by keeping a canary in a cage if the bird became distressed. It was a sign of bad air. The mines themselves presented another bizarre sleeping challenge. Some mines, particularly in the Comstock Lode in Nevada, were so deep that the temperature at the bottom was unbearably hot, a constant steamy heat that could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The miners working there would descend into a tropical hell, their bodies pouring sweat. But at the end of their shift, they would have to ascend thousands of feet in a cold mine cage, their wet clothes suddenly freezing on their bodies in the frigid surface air. To go directly from that to a cold bunkhouse was a shock that the body struggled to withstand. Many miners suffered from chronic respiratory ailments because of these extreme and rapid temperature changes. Their sleep was often fitful, racked by coughing fits known as miners' consumption. For a significant portion of the town's population, sleep was not found in a bed at all, but in a chair, on a floor, or on a bar top. Saloons never closed. They were the social hubs, the news centers, and, for many, the only source of warmth they could access for free. A man with a few cents could buy a cheap beer and nurse it for hours, basking in the heat of a large iron stove. If he was a regular or had a sympathetic bartender, he might be allowed to sleep slumped over a table in a corner or on the hard wooden floor near the stove. It was a miserable, humiliating way to sleep, but it was preferable to freezing in the street. The saloon's warmth, however, was an illusion. Once the doors closed and the fires died, the cold would reclaim the space with a vengeance, and any man left inside would be in grave danger. The town also had its institutions, the jail and the hospital. A night in a frontier jail in winter was a severe punishment. Jails were often the most poorly constructed buildings in town, with iron-barred windows that offered no protection from the wind. Sheriffs were known to provide prisoners with minimal blankets, if any, as both a cost-saving measure and an added deterrent. A prisoner could beg for mercy for an extra blanket, but his pleas were often ignored. To survive a night in a cell during a blizzard required immense fortitude. Shivering through the night, pacing the small cell to keep blood flowing, was the only option. Hypothermia and frostbite were very real risks. Hospitals, conversely, were supposed to be places of healing, but in winter they were often as cold as the homes the patients came from. Heating a large ward was difficult. Steam radiators might line the walls, but they were often insufficient. Nurses would make rounds with piles of blankets, layering them on patients. Hot water bottles made of rubber or metal were constantly being filled and placed at the feet of bedridden patients to stave off chill. The fear of fire prevented the use of any open flames, so the heat was dry, static, and often inadequate. For a patient already weakened by illness or injury, the cold of a hospital ward could be the final, fatal complication. The technology of sleep was evolving, albeit slowly. The second half of the 19th century saw several innovations that began to change the nightly battle. One of the most significant was the widespread adoption of the coal-burning pot-bellied stove. Unlike a fireplace, a cast-iron stove was a marvel of efficiency. It was fully enclosed with controllable air vents, allowing for a slow, complete burn. It radiated heat from all sides, not just the front. It could be placed in the center of a room, heating the space more evenly. And it could burn coal, which produced more heat per unit than wood and lasted longer. A well-tended coal stove could keep a room warm through the night, with far less attention than a wood fire. It became the beating heart of countless Western homes, hotels, and offices. Another innovation was the rise of manufactured mattresses and springs. While still a luxury, the availability of mass-produced, standardized bedding meant that even middle-class families in towns could aspire to a more comfortable sleep. Companies like Simmons & Sealy began their rise, advertising the health benefits of their sanitary mattresses, which were less likely to harbor vermin than a homemade straw tick. Perhaps the most important technological shift was the arrival of the railroad. The railroad did more than just bring people and goods. It brought a consistent supply of manufactured items that could transform domestic life. It brought cheap, warm wool blankets from the mills of New England. It brought glass windows by the crate, allowing more homes to have the luxury of light and of view without the thermal penalty of paper. It brought pre-cut lumber for tighter-built homes. It brought coal from distant mines, making it a readily available fuel source even in treeless regions. The railroad shrank the West, and in doing so it made the winter a little less isolating, a little less desperate. A family could now order a catalogue from Montgomery Ward or Sears, Roebuck & Co. and have a new comforter, a better stove, or a stack of wool long johns delivered to the nearest depot, dramatically improving their ability to weather the cold. But technology could only do so much. The fundamental experience of winter sleep was dictated by the body itself. The pioneers and townsfolk of the West had an intimate physiological understanding of cold that most of us have lost. They knew the signs of hypothermia by heart, the violent shivering that was the body's first defense, the confusion and slurred speech that marked the second stage, the paradoxical feeling of warmth and the overwhelming desire to sleep that signaled the final, deadly descent. They knew that frostbite could set in on exposed skin in minutes. They knew that wet clothing was a death sentence. This knowledge was passed down in 1,000 small warnings and pieces of folk wisdom. Don't fall asleep in the snow. Rub snow on a frostbitten ear. A dangerous piece of advice, we now know. Keep your feet dry at all costs. This constant exposure to the cold also bred a certain tolerance. Modern studies have shown that people who regularly sleep in cold environments can undergo a metabolic adaptation. Their bodies become more efficient at generating heat through non-shivering thermogenesis, a process that burns brown fat. The pioneers likely developed this to a degree. Their bodies were simply better at managing the cold than ours are. They were hardened by it in a literal physiological sense. The psychological toll, however, was immense. The unrelenting nature of the winter cold, the short days and long nights, the isolation, the constant, low-grade anxiety about fire and fuel, it all contributed to a condition that today we would recognize as seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. They didn't have a name for it. They called it cabin fever, or simply the melancholies. It was a deep, pervasive depression that set in during the darkest months. People became irritable, lethargic, and despairing. The struggle for sleep was at the center of this. Lying awake for hours in the cold and dark, listening to the wind, gave the mind far too much room to dwell on fears and regrets. The promise of spring seemed like a distant, impossible dream. For some, the weight became too much to bear. The long winters were a contributing factor in suicides, a sad, quiet end noted in the brief, stark obituaries of frontier newspapers. Yet amidst the hardship, there was also a profound sense of community. The winter forced people together. Social life moved indoors. There were barn raisings in the fall, but in the winter, there were quilting bees, spelling bees, and church socials. These gatherings were not just for fun. They were a survival mechanism. They broke the monotony, provided emotional support, and were a chance to share resources and information. A neighbor might have a new technique for chinking, or a recipe for a salve to treat chapped hands. The shared experience of enduring the winter created powerful bonds. You knew that the family in the next valley or the shopkeeper down the street was fighting the same battle you were. This created a rugged, practical form of empathy. You checked on your elderly neighbors after a storm. You shared firewood if someone was running low. The community itself became a blanket, a shared source of warmth against the cold. The winter also shaped the culture of the West in subtle ways. The stories told around the hearth during the long nights became the region's mythology. Tales of narrow escapes from blizzards, of heroic journeys through snowdrifts to fetch a doctor, of the legendary cold of the winter of '86. These stories were repeated until they became legend. The winter was a character in these stories, the ultimate antagonist. It forged an identity of toughness and resilience that became the hallmark of the Western character. To have survived a winter in the Rockies or on the plains was a badge of honor, a proof of one's mettle. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Wild West was being tamed. Barbed wire closed the open range. Towns grew into cities. Technology continued to advance, but the winter never lost its power. It remained a fundamental force, a yearly reminder of the fragility of human enterprise in the face of nature. The memory of those brutal nights, of the desperate struggle for sleep, lingered in the bones of those who had lived through it, a chill that never fully went away. And as we will see in our final part, this story did not end with the closing of the frontier. The lessons learned in the sod huts and log cabins of the West would be carried forward into new challenges, from the frozen trenches of the First World War to the polar expeditions of the 20th century, and they continue to inform how we understand and combat the cold today. We have journeyed from the solitary homestead to the crowded boarding house, witnessing the immense and varied struggle for winter sleep across the American West. We've seen how ingenuity, community, and sheer force of will were deployed in a nightly battle for survival. But the story does not end with the fading of the frontier era. The knowledge hard won in those brutal winters, the principles of insulation, layering, and heat retention, did not vanish. Instead, it was codified, refined, and put to the test in even more extreme environments. The pioneers' fight for a warm bed was the foundational chapter in a much longer human story of conquering the cold. In this final part, we will follow that thread, exploring the legacy of these survival techniques and understanding from a modern scientific perspective just what was happening to the bodies of those pioneers as they huddled under their piles of blankets, and what we, in our climate-controlled world, have forgotten. First, let's consider the legacy. The men and women who grew up on the frontier, who learned to bank a fire and sew a sugan as children, carried those skills with them into the 20th century. They became the engineers, the soldiers, the explorers, and when faced with cold on an industrial or exploratory scale, they fell back on the old ways, now augmented by new materials and scientific understanding. Consider the First World War. In the frozen trenches of the Western Front, soldiers faced conditions that would have been familiar to a cowboy on the plains, but on a nightmarish, industrial scale. The ground was frozen mud. The beds were dugouts in the sides of trenches, often flooded with icy water. Here, the principles of the pioneer were life-saving. Soldiers were issued multiple wool blankets. They learned to build braziers, essentially large perforated metal cans, to burn whatever fuel they could scrounge, providing a small, focused heat. They used ground sheets, an evolution of the cowboy's oilcloth, to create a moisture barrier between themselves and the earth. They slept in shifts, huddled together for warmth in the crowded dugouts, their breath forming a frozen mist inside the confined space. The dreaded trench foot was a direct result of the same problem that plagued pioneers: prolonged exposure to cold and wet, which shuts down circulation and leads to gangrene. The solution was the same too: constant vigilance, drying feet whenever possible, and the use of clean, dry socks, a luxury in the trenches, but a military necessity understood from hard frontier experience. The great polar expeditions of the early 20th century, led by men like Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton, were the ultimate test of cold weather survival. These were scientific endeavors, but at their core they were exercises in logistics and sleep systems. Scott's expedition to the South Pole in 1912 relied on reindeer skin sleeping bags, a direct descendant of the buffalo robe. They used Primus stoves, sophisticated versions of the pioneer's fire, to melt snow for water and heat their tents. The tragedy of Scott's team, who perished on the return journey, was due to a complex set of factors, but the cold and their inability to adequately recover from its effects during sleep was a primary contributor. In contrast, Shackleton's legendary endurance expedition is a masterclass in survival. When their ship was trapped and crushed by ice, his men camped on the ice floes. They slept in tents, 2 men to a reindeer skin bag, sharing body heat exactly as a pioneer family would. They used every trick in the book. They built walls of snow blocks to act as windbreaks. They heated stones to warm their sleeping bags, and they maintained a ruthless discipline about dryness and hot meals. The knowledge that kept them alive was not invented in a lab. It was the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human encounter with deep, cold wisdom that the American pioneers had helped to reaffirm and document. This knowledge began to be systematized. The U.S. Army, drawing on lessons from the frontier in 2 world wars, developed the layered clothing system that is now standard for outdoor enthusiasts: a base layer to wick moisture, an insulating middle layer, and a waterproof outer shell. This is the scientific evolution of the pioneers' Union suit, wool shirt, and oilskin slicker. Modern sleeping bags with their sophisticated synthetic or down fills, their shaped hoods, and their temperature ratings are the direct, high-tech descendants of the cowboys' sugan and the homesteaders' featherbed. The principle is identical: to create and trap a layer of warm air around the body. We've just gotten much, much better at the materials and the engineering. So let's break down that principle with modern science. What exactly is happening when we sleep in the cold? The human body is a furnace, constantly generating heat through metabolism. At rest, and especially during sleep, our metabolic rate drops and our core body temperature naturally dips by a degree or 2. This is a programmed circadian rhythm. But in a cold environment, this dip can become dangerous. The body's goal is to maintain its core temperature around 98.6 degrees F, 37 degrees Celsius. To do this, it must balance heat production with heat loss. Heat is lost in 4 primary ways, and the pioneers were intuitively battling all of them. Conduction. This is direct heat transfer through contact with a colder object. The pioneer sleeping on a cold dirt floor or a cowboy on the frozen ground was losing heat through conduction at a rapid rate. Their solutions, the straw tick, the pine bough bed, the heated stone, were all attempts to create a layer of insulation, to break the conductive pathway between their warm body and the cold earth. Convection. This is heat loss to moving air or water. The wind whistling through the chinks in a cabin wall was stripping heat away from the sleepers through convection. The heavy bedding, the bed rugs, and the bed curtains in wealthy homes were all designed to create a still layer of air around the body, preventing convection currents from carrying away precious warmth. Radiation. All objects radiate infrared heat. Your body is constantly radiating heat to the colder walls, ceiling, and windows of a room. In a poorly insulated cabin, the walls could be near freezing, so the sleepers were effectively radiating their body heat to a 4-walled icebox. The only way to combat this was to heat the surrounding surfaces, which is why the massive stone fireplace was so crucial. The hot stones radiated heat back into the room, creating a more thermally neutral environment. Evaporation. When moisture on your skin evaporates, it cools you down. This is a great mechanism in summer, but deadly in winter. The pioneers knew that sweating in your long johns was dangerous. This is why wool was the miracle fabric. Unlike cotton, which absorbs moisture and holds it against the skin, promoting evaporative heat loss, wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture from vapor, sweat, before it even feels damp. It wicks the moisture away from the skin and holds it within the fiber's core, allowing the outer surface of the fabric to dissipate it without drawing heat from the body. This is why a wool blanket could feel warm, even if it was slightly damp. Now let's apply this to the pioneer's bed. When they burrowed under their mountain of covers, they were creating a microclimate. Their body heat would quickly warm the small enclosed space under the blankets. The wool and feather layers, being excellent insulators, drastically reduced heat loss through conduction and convection. The weight of the comforters, as we mentioned, served a purpose beyond mere comfort. It lightly compressed the layers of clothing they wore, reducing the volume of air within their sleeping system that needed to be heated. It also minimized air movement, further reducing convective loss. This is a principle used in modern weighted blankets, which are often praised for their calming effect, but which also, incidentally, improve thermal efficiency. The body's physiological response to this environment is fascinating. When you are cold, the body undergoes vasoconstriction. It narrows the blood vessels in your extremities, fingers, toes, ears, and the skin, to reduce blood flow and conserve heat for the vital organs in the core. This is why feet and hands get cold first. The pioneers knew this intimately. The pre-bed calisthenics were an attempt to force blood back into the extremities to warm up before entering the cold bed. The hot meal before bed was designed to stoke the metabolic furnace, triggering diet-induced thermogenesis to produce more internal heat. And the practice of huddling together was a form of shared thermoregulation. Multiple bodies in a confined space created a warmer ambient air temperature within the bed, reducing the thermal gradient and thus the rate of heat loss for everyone. It was a biological collective. What about the risk of suffocation under all those heavy blankets? It was a real concern, especially for children. However, the bedding materials, while heavy, were not entirely airtight. Wool and cotton are breathable fabrics. They allow for the passage of water vapor and some air exchange. The real danger was from the fire, from sparks, or from bringing a poorly sealed bed warmer filled with live embers under the covers. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly vented stoves was a far greater and more common silent killer than suffocation by blanket. Let's return to the mental aspect, which we can now view through a modern lens. The cabin fever and melancholies of the pioneers align perfectly with what we now know as seasonal affective disorder, SADI. The lack of sunlight during the short winter days disrupts our circadian rhythms and reduces the production of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that affects mood. The result is depression, lethargy, and sleep disturbances, difficulty waking up, oversleeping, and a general feeling of fatigue. The pioneers were experiencing a clinically recognized condition, but they had no light therapy boxes, no vitamin D supplements. Their only remedies were willpower, community, and the hope of spring. The intense physical labor of survival may have actually been a partial antidote, as vigorous exercise is a known booster of serotonin and endorphins. This leads us to a crucial and perhaps uncomfortable comparison. How does our modern sleep environment compare to that of a frontier family? We live in a world of thermal stability. Our bedrooms are kept within a narrow, comfortable temperature range year-round. We have memory foam mattresses that conform to our bodies, lightweight down comforters that provide immense warmth without weight, and electric blankets that can preheat the bed to the exact desired temperature. We have eliminated almost all the physical discomforts and mortal dangers that defined the pioneers' nightly experience, but have we lost something in the process? Sleep scientists today are increasingly interested in the effects of temperature on sleep quality. It turns out our bodies are designed to sleep in a cool environment. That natural dip in core body temperature is a key signal that initiates sleep. A room that is too warm can actually interfere with sleep onset and reduce the quality of restorative deep sleep. The National Sleep Foundation recommends a bedroom temperature of around 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 to 19 degrees Celsius, for optimal sleep. The pioneers, ironically, may have had this aspect right, albeit through necessity rather than choice. The room was cold, often very cold, but their bed microclimate was warm. They were creating a perfect sleep environment, a cool ambient air temperature with a warm, cozy nest. This combination likely facilitated a rapid onset of sleep and, provided they were warm enough to avoid shivering, allowed for solid, deep sleep cycles. The constant, gentle physical pressure of heavy blankets may have also provided a soothing, swaddling effect, reducing nighttime anxiety. In our pursuit of perfect comfort, we may have created an environment that is sometimes too neutral, too devoid of the gentle thermal cues that our ancient physiology expects. There's also the matter of light. The pioneers lived by the sun. Their evenings were dark, lit only by firelight, which emits a warm, orange glow that does not suppress melatonin, the sleep hormone, in the same way that the blue light from our screens does. Their circadian rhythms were tightly locked to the natural world, while their sleep was often fragmented by the need to tend the fire or check on children. It was arguably more in sync with their biology than the sleep of a modern city dweller who stares at a smartphone until midnight. So, what can we learn from the brutal winters of the Wild West? Their story is more than a historical curiosity. It is a masterclass in human adaptation. It teaches us the fundamental principles of staying warm: insulation, layering, moisture management, and the conservation of metabolic heat. It reminds us of the profound importance of community and shared resources in the face of adversity. And it offers a poignant reflection on our own relationship with the environment and with sleep itself. The next time you crawl into your warm, safe bed on a cold night, take a moment to remember the homesteader listening to the wolfish wind, the cowboy tightening his sugan around his shoulders, the miner in his smoky bunkhouse. Remember the weight of the blanket, the smell of the wood smoke, the feel of a heated stone at your feet, the sound of a loved one's breathing close by. Their struggle was real, immediate, and life-threatening. Their solutions were born of ingenuity and desperation. They didn't just survive those brutal winters, they learned from them. They forged a knowledge of cold that has in many ways insulated us to this day. They passed down not just stories, but a deep, embodied understanding of how to find rest and safety in the heart of a storm. And in doing so, they turned the simple, desperate act of sleep into a quiet, courageous victory, night after frozen night.